Go ahead and introduce the panelists for today. And just to give a basic sense of what we'll be doing, each of the SNCC veterans will be talking for 10 minutes about key lessons they learned from SNCC and how they have applied those lessons to their activism in the Bay Area. And then we'll be hearing from some young organizers from SF Rising. So after 40 minutes, there's going to be an intergenerational dialogue. And following that, we'll leave 15 minutes at the end to be in some community conversation. And so we're going to start with Mike Miller, and I'm going to give everyone a brief introduction. Mike was part of the student movement at UC Berkeley, and as SNCC's representative of Northern California and the head of the Friends of SNCC Bay Area chapter, he played an important role in mobilizing the West Coast to support the Black freedom struggle in the South. Mike also organized in the Mississippi Delta. He's a serious student of Saul Alinsky, helped to coordinate the first farm workers union boycott, and has been supported by SNCC, and has been active in anti-urban renewal efforts and doing that organizing in San Francisco for a long time. In 1972, he founded the Organized Training Center in San Francisco, where he has led trainings on community and labor organizing ever since. And he is the author of a number of books, including A Community Organizer's Tale, People in Power in San Francisco, as well as People Power, the community organizing tradition of Saul Alinsky, and Community Organizing and Introduction. So, Mike, would you like to share with us some key lessons you learned?
Yeah, let me start by telling you how I got involved. There was in '58 at Berkeley, we had an organization called SLATE, which was one of the early organizations of the student movement. In 1962, SLATE sponsored a summer conference titled The Negro in America. And we invited Chuck McDew, who was then chairman of SNCC, to be our keynote speaker. And as it turned out, Chuck stayed at my place I shared with longshoreman Herb Mills, who some of you know. And at the end of his stay, he asked me to be the SNCC rep here. So I was, needless to say, honored, and I didn't have to think very much, and I said yes. And I was on the SNCC staff for 4 years. Let me say something about the character of SNCC. It was, in the first place, an extraordinary group of people. I've never been in the company of such a concentration of talent, goodwill, warmth. It was a wonderful experience for me. SNCC started in the sit-ins, and the sit-ins were campus-based on the historically black colleges and universities and seminaries in the South, mostly in the Mid-South, but some of them further south. And in its next year, it was a key organization in the Freedom Rides, which had been started by CORE. CORE had stopped them in Alabama, and SNCC said, no, we can't let the racists stop us because they burned our bus. We're going to continue on to Jackson. And SNCC organized the last leg of the Freedom Rides. But SNCC people started asking themselves, where are local people in all this? You know, they love what we're doing, but we don't see much of their participation. And so they, in part with the advice of Ella Baker, an unsung heroine of the Southern movement, they asked local leaders, who Ella Baker had a list of them because she'd been the director of branches of the NAACP. And almost everyone said, we've got to get registered to vote. And so a transformation, an organizational transformation took place in SNCC in a very brief period of time that I haven't seen anybody really explain very well. It went from a coordinating committee of campus-based groups to full-time organizers, an organization of full-time organizers and their support staff. Support staff included research, photography, education, fundraising, and so on. So that, by the time I got on the SNCC staff, it had made this shift. And in 63 and 64, there was a lot of hope, although people were getting frustrated with the Justice Department and the failure of the federal government to enforce any protection over their lives. But there was still hope, and the Summer Project of 1964 developed out of the desire to force the federal government to intervene. There had been a murder of a local civil rights leader in, I think it was a but it might have been Pike County. And it was pretty obvious that it was a result of an FBI leak to local Klan people. And so the Summer Project was in part an effort to, as Bob Moses used to put it, bring the country to Mississippi. And it did indeed succeed in doing that. And as all of you know, 3 of the Summer Project workers, 1 local black guy from Meridian and 2 white staff people, 1 a Corps full-time staffer and the other a summer volunteer, were killed. That tipped the scale on having the Summer Project. There were a lot of people in SNCC who did not want the Summer Project. They thought the presence of a bunch of whites from northern elite schools would push aside, like I just did that model, would push aside local talent, and they were very worried about that. But local leaders wanted it, and so there was an ironic division between local Mississippi leaders and the young staff of SNCC. The murder of this guy in Amid or Pike tipped the scale, especially for Bob Moses. Bob had been kind of neutral. All of you know he's a key person in all of this. So the Summer Project's main effort was to get people geared up for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge at the 1964 Democratic Party convention of the seating of the racist delegation. There's a procedure in the Credentials Committee of the political party that if you don't think the delegation purporting to represent a state is legitimate, you can challenge it. And if you get a certain number, I think it was 19, but I'm not sure, maybe it was 11, if you got a certain number of votes on the Credentials Committee, a very large committee, you could get a minority report out of that committee, and that minority report would go to the floor of the convention. And it was SNCC's belief that if we could get a minority report to the convention floor with the presence of international media and so on, that we would win the challenge. And but Lyndon Johnson was determined not only not to have Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party represent Mississippi Democrats, but not to have Fannie Lou Hamer as one of its on the floor of the convention. He called her that illiterate plantation worker or something like that. So the Democrats offered 2 honorary seats at large, one for Aaron Henry and the other for, his name is escaping me, the white Ed King, yeah, white minister at Tougaloo College who was Aaron Henry's running mate in an earlier election for statewide office. So Lyndon Johnson systematically peeled off votes. One person's husband who was up for a federal court judgeship, you forget about that federal court judgeship if you don't vote for me. Well, I got 1 vote. Another person from, I think it was Idaho, one delegates from Idaho, you want that dam built in Idaho, you forget about it if we don't have your vote. And the minority, the number required for the minority report disappeared. There was tremendous disaffection as a result of that. Tremendous upset in SNCC. And so there are, now let me get to the point of lessons, because I think I'm running out of time.
We got 2 minutes.
So lesson number one, if you don't, in the early stages of a movement, if you don't take on battles that are winnable, you face a serious problem of disaffection. And despite that, the challenge might have been a good idea. I've debated with myself about the challenge forever. My mind spends more time on the challenge than any other single topic. Secondly, though, SNCC might not have gone into a tailspin. SNCC went into a tailspin after that spread over several years. There were exceptions within it. The Louds County Freedom Organization was an extraordinary exception. But SNCC was in a tailspin. And I asked Bob Moses a few years before his death, we were working together on the Algebra Project, what should SNCC have done differently? And Bob said, we should have all gone away to Highlander or some retreat center, and we should have taken as long as it would take to restore the sense of community, sisterhood, and brotherhood that had bonded us together in the past. We didn't do that. Some people went off to Africa. Harry Belafonte paid for everyone to go to Guinea and Ghana. Others went off to alcohol, drugs. I mean, it was, so the beginning of the end, I think, was that defeat. And then ideological differences that I came to think of in this circumstance, ideology not as a guide to understanding, but as a rationalization for defeat. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Mike. We got a tape right here.
Oh, fantastic.
It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Daphne Muse next. And Daphne Muse graduated from Fisk University in 1967, where she studied under Harlem Renaissance writer Arla, is it Bontemps or Bontemps?
Arnold Bontemps.
Arnold Bontemps.
Mm-hmm.
And soon afterwards, she began managing the Drum and Spear bookstore, which was a bookstore and cultural center that was founded by members of SNCC. After moving to California in 1971, Daphne became a secretary to the legal defense team for the Angela Davis trial. And as a professor at Berkeley and at Mills College, Daphne has spent decades curating exhibits and events about Black history, literature, and politics. She's hosted numerous prominent Black writers and scholars throughout her lifetime, and her correspondence with freedom fighters from around the entire world is vast, consisting of 5,000 letters exchanged with everyone from Toni Morrison to Barack Obama. Daphne is the author of 4 books, a screenplay, a series of poems, recently including her recent love poem to Harriet. I took this from something a few years ago. So. In 2021, Daphne became the elder in residence for the Black Studies Collaboratory at the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. And Daphne, I wanted to go with you second because the theme of this book fair is against amnesia. And we chose that theme because for years now, we've seen attacks on history, social justice history, especially Black history, and it's taken the form of attacks on the 1619 Project, so-called critical race theory, attacks on ethnic studies, book bans, on and on. And you have spent so much of your life lifting up all of that history. So I was wondering if you had lessons to share from us, really from anything that you learned from SNCC and how you've applied that in all of your organizing, but especially in that realm of lifting up that history and fighting those kinds of attacks.
And then Drum and Spear and then SNCC opened a bookstore called Drum and Spear. in 1968. Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobb, Judy Richardson founded Drum and Spear Bookstore and Drum and Spear Press. I was teaching elementary school in Washington, D.C., and I was also working at Brentano's bookstore. I went into Drum and Spear to buy some children's books for my students, and Joe Gross, who was the manager at that time, said, "Why are you working for them white people at Brentano's? Come up here and work for us." And I said, "Okay." And they didn't know me from anybody. I had worked a little bit with SNCC on campus at Fisk, entering the movement, actually through the anti-war movement was my introduction to SNCC. And Drum and Spear, through its bookstore and press, continued the legacy of SNCC in a way that opened it up more broadly to Pan-Africanism and global politics. And I often tell people that I don't have a PhD, but if I had a PhD, it would be a PhD from Drum and Spear Bookstore. I was brought into the most intellectually dynamic group of people I had ever met. They were so brilliant, so historically grounded, so passionate that when I would go home in the evening, it was like I had to deconstruct my head to wrap my mind around all that was happening. And shortly after I started working at the bookstore, Ralph Featherstone was the manager under whom I worked. And Ralph and I bonded. I mean, I learned so much from him. And I will never forget the day that 4 young men came into the bookstore who had just had their book published by Drum and Spear Press. It was called Enemy of the Sun, a collection of Palestinian poetry, published in 1970 by Drum and Spear Press. We are working diligently to republish that book in this moment. We've been working for the past 12 years, one of the editors and I, and other groups involved. And I learned so much about strategic thinking, how your emotions take you to one place, but how you have to organize that passion in a fashion that translates into something viable, something that educates people, something that feeds people, something that organizes people. And those people from SNCC were masterful at organizing. I had just never seen anybody be able to take chaos, ideological chaos, sometimes romantic chaos, social chaos, all of that, and channel it into something that was so productive. And a lot of the community became involved. I call them the hood bards, the brothers on the block who were spitting rhymes before Diddy and all these other people were spitting rhymes, who came in and with passion helped us build shelves in the store, helped us when we would bring people in to speak, that they were a part of bringing the community into the store. So it wasn't just a repository of intellectuals and movement people, but it really, the strategies that SNCC developed in the South really translated into that bookstore and into Drum and Spear Publishing Company. And the level of day-to-day activity in the store was always heightened by the fact that Amamu Baraka, he was Leroy Jones then, came into the store. We did events with Gwendolyn Brooks. The FBI was a regular customer in the store. I shouldn't say customer, presence, because they would come in the store and pluck books off the shelf and say, oh, this isn't shit. I read this isn't shit. And the store was set on fire once. The store was robbed twice. The challenges that we had to rise above were real and terrifying. But, you know, I was young, and you deal with terror a little bit differently when you are not as seasoned. You deal with it a little differently. But the vision that was laid out by Charlie and Cortland and Jennifer Lawson and Judy Richardson and Ralph Featherstone was something that I continue to hold on to, and that as an educator, it is also something that I continue to bring forward. And one of the greatest lessons that I learned from Drum and Spear is every single time I touched Black lives and cultures, I took it home. Mm-hmm. So these 5,000 letters that I have, that's because I insisted that I put my voice in the mix of this movement to let people know that these are the kinds of things that matter. And I had, at one point, I had a collection of 22,000 books. I'm down to 12 now. All of that nurtured by the passion that Drum and Spear imbued in me, and the vision and the ability to think around curves, and the ability also to work intersectionally, because the SNCC people were very good, in my experience, were very good about working beyond boundaries, very strategically, and bringing people into not only the conversation, but the actions that were necessary in the efforts that were being made to move lives forward. So I think the greatest lesson I learned was how to take something that really is chaotic and needle out and ferret out the things that you can use to organize around it, and how to tune my listening as I've gotten older, really tuning my listening across the generations, because you all hear, taste, smell, and feel the earth differently than we did. You walk it differently, and it's certainly manifested in your music, that's for sure. And it's been critical for me to be able to hear you so I can continue to do the work, because without your voice, what I try to do is meaningless. So thank you.
By the way, I want to give a shout out to Oasis in the Diaspora.
Oh.
You mentioned that large. You've found other homes for over 10,000 books, but you're still finding homes for the other ones. Is Oasis in the Diaspora?
Yes,
is that a place where they can do that downstairs?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Please check out the table Oasis in the Diaspora.
Table number 10.
Fran Beal, I'm gonna ask you to go next. I feel if you can unmask. I'll unmask too while we're speaking. Fran is also going to be getting into, and maybe Phil, you will too, perhaps. But I know you wanted to speak to some of the international dimensions of SNCC and of Palestine, and of course Daphne gave voice to that. And so you'll see why I'm asking why Fran is following on that. So Fran is the daughter of a Black father and a Russian Jewish mother, and she experienced both anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism growing up as a child. During the early civil rights years, she studied in France for 6 years, where she became keenly aware of anti-colonial freedom struggles. She was deeply influenced This is the period of African liberation following World War II. She's deeply influenced by her interactions with colonized people who were living in France, and she helped to organize Malcolm X's visit to Paris as part of a number of other organizations working on that. And Fran was paying attention to SNCC while she was living in France. She immediately joined SNCC upon returning to the US. And given her internationalist stance, she worked in SNCC's New York office, and specifically with SNCC's International Affairs Commission. Fran also co-founded SNCC's Black Women's Liberation Committee in order to challenge patriarchy in movement spaces. And that committee soon evolved into the much broader Third World Women's Alliance. So Fran is the author of the seminal Black feminist text, and very important text in the history of intersectionality, called Double Jeopardy, To Be Black and Female. And she has spent her life fighting for racial justice, women's rights, and for human rights around the world. And so, Fran, I'd like to invite you to share whatever lessons from SNCC you'd like to, but I do know that you had requested from me to maybe be able to speak to what SNCC was doing around Palestine.
Well, I guess I'm best known for the work I've done in terms of women's liberation. So let me just speak a little bit about that. Given the period that we're in, there are a lot of people who were trying to bring nationalist ideas into the organization. I think Mike spoke a little bit about some of the ideological struggles that were going on. And one of the struggles that was going on is whether the skin analysis or the race analysis was the correct one in terms of how do you look at Black racism and the struggle for racial justice. Basically, the class analysis versus the racist analysis. Foreman was the one who was trying to formulate an idea that there was a cross-section, is the word that he used at that time, between race and class, and that SNCC always had a class approach to struggle. So if people remember what people used to wear in the South, are those overalls, that was an attempt to identify with the poorest of us. There was SNCC's statement that you had to organize the poorest of us, the meekest of us, those who were the most without power. And that was a guiding point of the argument. In other words, we were not trying to get the doctors or the lawyers or things, although there was a recognition that racism went across class lines, but that was not the main effort of its organizing focus at all. So I just want to say that the ideological and theoretical framework I carried into the organizing of women, so that when we tried at a theoretical, Linda, hi. When we went into the organizing of women, so we tried to figure out how women's oppression, how gender oppression fixed in with racial and class oppression. And that's how we came up with, that was a SNCC formulation, race, class, and gender. And if you take a look at the Third World Women's Alliance newspaper, it says racism, sexism, imperialism. Now that was an important concept because in SNCC at the, and I have a little bit of a different assessment of the deterioration of SNCC and the end of SNCC. Basically, people in SNCC had taken up the job of fighting and ending Jim Crow. And with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Bill Act of 1965, that task at a legal level was essentially accomplished. So to me, it was not that the organization went downhill because it couldn't, although that happened, and it was still trying to figure out what its role was. I personally, from a perspective of 50 years, think that its task was done, and that's the essential reason why it went out of business. Because it had the role that it had set for itself was no longer there. I came into, I have to say, SNCC, I met Foreman prior to that period. And I'll never forget the day when I came back, moved back to the United States. I found the SNCC office in New York, and when I walked in, Jim threw his arm around me, gave me a kiss on both cheeks, and said, "Thank God you come," because he knew that at that point, I was completely fluent in French. And he said, "We need someone who can translate for us so that we know what is going on in terms of these meetings." And that was something that you learned about Foreman. He had a talent of identifying people and being able to bring them in to do either a specific task or play a specific role in terms of whatever he had in mind at the time. So I began working in the New York office of SNCC, and this is where the headquarters of what we called MBWADO, that stood for National Black Anti-War Anti-Draft Union. But we wanted at the end, we said MBWADO because we were going through a stage ourselves of black identity, and we said, "Oh, that sounds African, that's very good word for our anti-war effort." In any case, it was stationed in the New York office because the International Affairs Commission had been stationed there, and the International Affairs Commission had been stationed there because the United Nations was in New York. So my introduction to SNCC was actually, I had made a couple of trips down south when I had come back during the summer, and I kind of met a number of the SNCC activists at that time, but I myself did not work explicitly as a SNCC staffer until I came back. And let me talk a little bit about the formation of the SNCC Black Women's Liberation Committee. Foreman had gone out to the West Coast and he had met with the Panthers, and he came back, and he also was beginning to introduce himself to Marxist ideas. Mm-hmm. So he came back and he was just, he was talking about the book Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. And he said, "This is such a wonderful book, and we should read it, and we should buy copies of it, and we should just distribute it as much as we can possibly do." So Gwen Patton, and Mae Jackson, and I think her name was Diane Watson, and myself, who sort of made up the core of MBWADO in New York. Although Johnny Wilson was the theoretical head, as was, typical at the time. The women did the work and the men got the glory, for it. But that was just, a part of the way things were in terms of particular that time. Although I have to say, my own view is that if you compared SNCC to the other civil rights organization, there was much more democracy relative to what women did and the women's roles than there was in the other organization. This is not to say that sexism did not play a daily role in terms of things, but with a woman like Ella Baker as the head of the organization, as a role model, it was difficult to say women should go to the back of the bus, you know, type thing. However, during the late, 60s, people were very interested in Malcolm X. They loved Malcolm X. And some of people who took on nationalist ideas began to bring their attitudes toward women into the organization. And they began to talk about, abortion was a genocide, and women should now be taking a step backward. And he said to them, do you realize that you are sounding very much like the Moynihan Report, which defined women as the enemy and as the cause of it? I'm getting a can of it.
Well, I want to make sure you also get the chance to say what you like about Palestine as well.
I want to say that just in terms of the women's stuff, we organized against that book. And it was a book which talked about raping black women in order to get up the nerve to rape white women. That's how we read that book. And a lot of people were afraid to say it at the time, but we were not afraid to say it. And for us organizationally, it became for organizing the Black Women's Liberation Committee. But let me talk a little bit about the International Affairs Commission.
Fran, we have about 2 minutes to do this.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
All right. A lot of people don't recognize the fact that going on this particular period, there was a lot of talk about freedom and liberation going on. And the way the commission was founded is when this group that was, I think it was Mike, who went to Africa, they found a booklet that was published by the CIA, the Agency for International Development. And in it, there's a picture of Fannie Lou Hamer, and under it, there was a caption that talked about her being seated at the Democratic Convention. So they completely lied about it. And Foreman and some other people realized that they needed our own organization, our own contacts with the liberation movements in order to tell our own story, because we did not want the CIA distorting the story that was going on. So I want to talk about 2 things since I don't have very much space. One of the people that people don't know about a lot is Sammy Young Jr. He was a SNCC activist who was then murdered in 1966. And basically because it was the negligence of the feds, they were asked to come in because the people had been threatened, and they did not come in. I was going to read something that John Lewis, who was then the president, said. He was very radical at the time. So that was in 1966. They took after that, there had been some debate in the organization about maybe we shouldn't have that because there would be political consequences of taking a stand on Vietnam. However, at the SDS founding conference, they asked for a SNCC speaker, and Bob Moses was that speaker, and he spoke against the war in Vietnam and made the link between the struggle for democracy in the South and the struggle for liberation that was going on in Vietnam. So then the SNCC actually came out in January of '66 with a statement taking a position against the war in Vietnam and linking it to the ongoing struggle.
Right.
It should not be,
We're gonna have to wrap up in just a few seconds here.
okay, he's being really mad, I just wanna thank.
I'm sorry.
Things don't change.
I
Put the
apologize.
blame on him, not me for talking to them. I just want to make the statement that SNCC made a statement around Palestine way back in 1967. I think it was March of 1967 when the statement came out, and then it was one of the lessons that we learned from that is there was a media attack on SNCC for anti-Semitism, basically because we challenged the Israeli policy that were going on in the Middle East. And people can go up on the internet if they want to see a copy of that statement. But basically it laid out the history of Israel in terms of being given the land, and in which the majority of the people were Arabs. And of course the conflict has been going on ever since then. But that's been the big elephant in the room that most of the media has not talked about in terms of what is going on today. So my lesson is there's a link between the anti-racist struggles that are going on today, and that in terms of Palestine, a ceasefire now immediately needs to be the immediate demand of everybody, regardless of what you think in terms of Israel or Palestine and the movement for liberation there. The public demand for a ceasefire is absolutely vital.
Thank you, Fran. I want to fully recognize, before I introduce Phil Hutchings, that every person up on this panel could do, we could learn from them for years and endlessly and have seminars, as we could from so many people in this room. And I think asking Fran to cover the international dimension of SNCC and also the fight against gender oppression within SNCC is a lot to ask. In a simple 10 minutes. It's a real honor to introduce Phil Hutchings. And Phil, I want to read a short bio of you. Phil was a student of Howard University. He was a member of the SNCC affiliated group at Howard called NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group. He left college to join the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where he learned valuable community organizing skills, which he later put to use in a northern context. So I'm going to read a quote from SNCC Digital Gateway, and if you guys want excellent resources about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, check out the SNCC Digital Gateway, as well as the SNCC Legacy Project, profound resources. So to quote from the SNCC Legacy Project, Phil Hutchings pioneered Black power in a northern urban setting, fighting for community control over public institutions. His work in Newark impressed SNCC, which was looking for ways to organize in the urban north. And Phil Hutchings is the last chairperson of SNCC, serving after Stokely Carmichael, and then H. Brown. Phil Hutchings was the last chairperson of SNCC. In that capacity, he helped to guide it through some of the most difficult moments in that organization's history. He later moved to Oakland, and in Oakland he's been a co-founder of Just Cause, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and the Institute for Multiracial Justice. So we could give a hand to Phil Hutchings, please.
Thank you. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to say today. And talking about SNCC which I've talked about way too much over the time. I mean, and trying to figure out what SNCC really was for me individually. And I would say that just to keep going forward, is that probably the two things I was most interested in learning and felt I still am, is how to become an organizer. And it's enough, because there's so many things to learn, so many new things to learn, and then how do you communicate them with people? And so the two parts that I learned through SNCC and the movement around that was, how do you talk about things like democracy and freedom without dumbing it down to the average people, which is what we get at best in our newspapers and things like that. And so part of being in SNCC, and particularly when I was in Mississippi, one of the things I learned from someone like Fannie Lou Hamer was how you could be in a small meeting and you could talk about very complicated and complex things. And you didn't have to dumb down the discussion. Now, part of it was learning how to do that. And one of the things that I learned as a college student, coming from Howard University, is that I'd have to look very carefully of how what I said and how people took it and how people understood it. And that was not necessarily just a one-shot deal, like 1 5-minute conversation. So one of the things I learned, which I think is part of the SNCC organizing experience, is how to listen to people. And that's the first thing you do before you come in with campaigns, literature, and all that. Because you want to see what people basically want to talk about in terms of their lives. And Mississippi, later Newark, I was in Detroit in the 70s, helped me learn how to do that. And I'm not finished yet, because these young people come up with new ways to say things and do things and that push the bar correctly. The other thing, which is somewhat related but different, is in practice mostly in Newark, out here in the Bay Area, is how do African Americans or people from the African American experience learn to live with, to meet with people from other parts of the world, like Latin America, and like parts of Asia, Southeast Asia. What do they need to learn how to survive in a new place where there's a lot of hostility against them, sometimes from African Americans? I used to go out in East Oakland and sit in barbershops, and people would say, "Phil, are you still talking about them damn immigrants?" That was the beginning discussion. It's like beginning under the 8 ball. But that's where you learn, because that's what people are saying, what they feel free to say. And how do you convince them that it was the corporations that have taken their jobs other places, brought in new people, less money, and show them that how that actually happens in their life. That takes time, and also how are these discussions mediated? I mean, the one in East Oakland was one with through the Catholic Church, not the most liberal group to do. But they were concerned about what was happening with the living situation out in Far East Oakland. As more Latinos particularly moved into areas that blacks used to live in, and blacks were a little bit upset, like what happened to our neighborhoods or our church particularly. And so how do you have those discussions and in a positive way? And so that was a lot of what I worked on and still work on, and worked on with somebody else who has not been mentioned today in SNCC, Elizabeth Betita Martinez, Chicana, who lives in San Francisco, and we started the Institute for Multiracial Justice, just to do that. And how to talk about, I remember when the Iraq War came up, and we tried to talk about how to, you get people of color to see that they're the ones who are first drafted or encouraged to volunteer as the draft itself went down. And how also the brainwashing can work also. As you see more and more African-American people, Latinos, integrated into the US government military services, and we have a Secretary of Defense who's African-American, and has been running around the world, Palestine, other places, in most recent times with Blinken and our president, to try to convince people. So the international question, race, communication, color, class, is really very important. So that's been where my emphasis has been, and I try to keep it that way because there's a lot to learn from even cities to city out here, and you go to Richmond, it's not that much like Oakland in many ways. There are parts of it that are, but Richmond has its own different core things that make it quite, when you try to organize something, it makes it quite different. So that's, I found, fills me up. And given the time, I just want to say that the other place to take it on is in the international level. And so, I mean, one of the things I got interested in and learned about out here in the Bay Area was this solidarity movement and how you work. And it's one thing to be excited about a country's liberation struggle and basically put out literature. And another thing to hear people experience for themselves. And I'll give you an example. Were the Palestinians, or are the Palestinians. I remember back in the 80s, 1980s, a lot of the people who were political from Palestine were basically didn't understand the United States. Their English was kind of faulty and not too easily understood. And so they needed allies to even just look over. I mean, we had the Palestine Focus, we had the different I think not just newspapers, but catalogs and things that would give people in the United States some idea who are these people, you know, who have the. I'm sorry, I have Parkinson's, and my speech sometimes gets halted, but my ideas don't. And
thank goodness.
yeah, so been trying to work on that level. And what's interesting now is there are 20 years later, or more, there's a new group of Palestinians too. And they basically have spent more time in the United States. They grew up here. They speak English. Right? They speak as well as we do, English, but maybe better. They understand the nuances of to a great degree of living in America and how it affects them and where they do and do not fit in. So working with them has become much easier. I used to spare space at 522 Valencia with the AROC, the group that's been very prominent in the movements now and demonstrations now. And so when you work with people and share ideas, and it's a different level. And the other part of it is a different level. Bishop, I'm gonna be brief here.
Well, we got 2 minutes, so
Okay.
please.
Is going to the country where they're from. So going to Cuba, going to Brazil. The only place I haven't been, unfortunately, and I'm really pissed off about it, my fault, is Africa. I've been to Africa. And, but if you're working with a political organization in their own country, the level of seeing what they do, how they do it, how you can see they're similar or different from what we're used to in terms of work, is really an important level of stage of growth. They haven't had the World Social Forums lately, but that was a way for Americans, North Americans, to see how people in the third world or in the South actually work for things, survival. I mean, we would go to those things in nonprofit organizations, funded and stuff like that, and then we're working with groups who don't get funding and have a whole different reality. But these are the people who are the majority of the world. And that's how we have to learn to work with people and build that alliance. And I would just say one last thing, in terms of the Palestine issue, as a supporter of Palestine, is that I think that what happened on October 7th was a date we will look back on years from now and say something happened here that basically changed things. That the Western way of organizing politics, organizing the world, organizing forums and stuff, is basically took a major hit. Because what this war is about in Gaza, but only a part of it is Gaza, because what's happening all over the world, is that the third world is standing up in a way that it never stood up before, was able to. And the U.S. is being challenged. Everybody's saying the U.S. is in decline. They are. And it's declining on many, many levels. But you have other groups that are beginning to stand up, like the BRICS group of nations. And that's not the liberation movement. But it's basically a place to develop space, to take the struggle to another level. And get people who never had the basis or the ability to be in one room talking politics without the fear of being chastised by their multilateral sponsors from the West. They're starting to do that now. And that's not going to change. And so I think in 25 years, or the next 25 to 50 years, there's going to be a whole new picture on the continent, which also will weave in with the things around the climate change. But who's most affected by the climate change? The third world.
Yeah.
And so more can be said about that, but I'm just trying to give you my general opinion on that.
Thank you so much. We're going to transition into some intergenerational dialogue. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jacob Mata and Natalya Bomani. And they're two organizers with SF Rising. If you're not familiar, please check out SF Rising. And I'm going to read some brief bios of you two. And then it would be fantastic to hear the lessons that have really landed with you and any further questions you might have about those lessons for the SNCC veterans. So Jacob is originally from the Central Valley. He's rooted himself into the community as a field organizer at SF Rising, where he's developed the leadership skills of students and working class folks to door knock and phone bank around student debt and free college, public safety, affordable housing, and taxing the wealthy. Jacob considers himself to be a student of SNCC. He has researched SNCC and its philosophy of organizing extensively during his time at SF State, where he graduated with a BA in Race and Resistance Studies in the College of Ethnic Studies. He remains committed to upholding and advancing the core tenets of organizing for power that were developed by SNCC field organizers that demonstrated the importance of developing deep relationships and the leadership skills that students and working class communities of color already possess. Natalya has, her bio is continuing their Tanzanian lineage, weaved by decolonial resistance. Natalya is a multimedia artist and a scholar organizer building at the intersection of PIC abolition and restorative youth justice. Natalya holds a BA in political science and sociology from the University of San Francisco, where they organize direct actions advocating for issues like fair tuition, cops off campus. They have co-paneled the USFCA Global Women's Rights Forum, exploring mutual aid organizing, and moderated a discussion on reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans with Dr. Cornel West and Chinyere Opara. Did I pronounce her name right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Further putting Black feminist theory into practice, Natalya has base-built working-class people into the struggles for free college, labor rights, and community alternatives to policing, while leading political education workshops to develop young people's lexicon for bottom-up transformation. Natalya is eager to continue following the steadfast leadership of people like Angela Davis, Kwame Ture, Ella Baker, and SNCC organizers in their ongoing pursuit of actualizing a liberatory future moment to moment. Let's give a warm welcome to Jacob and Natalya. So if you could share, key lessons that stood out to you, any questions for these SNCC veterans that you'd like to learn more from?
Yeah, of course. I'll just say it's a huge honor to be here. I think as someone who spent a lot of time going through archives, finding things online, reading crap to the books, it's kind of a very surreal moment to be here with y'all.
I'm going to interrupt real quick. I do want to welcome both of you to take your masks off as you speak.
I'll take mine off. I will say, I was trying to prepare what I wanted to say here, and I was like, what do I look at? And I have a collection of notes that I've taken over the course of the years on things, but I really want to lead with my own experience as an organizer, right? I think hearing some of the stuff that you mentioned, Mike, around what happened after the MFDP defeat in 1964, and this sense that you should have taken more time to rest and reflect. So I'm wondering, if you could expand a little bit more on that. I think as an organizer, for my own part, I recognize that, we do a lot as organizers. You don't just communicate with people, right? You put on meetings. There's a lot of little things that a lot of people don't recognize. So I'm wondering, if you could talk a little bit more about, how to make the organizing more sustainable and, what you are reflecting on now, knowing that, that's what you probably should have needed in that moment.
Well, there are two terms that I use in my work. One is reflection. And reflection means that after or before an action, people talk about what it means to them. What is the meaning of this for me? And they share their personal stories that invest meaning into that action. So it isn't just about getting a cup of coffee at the lunch counter at Woolworths. It's about breaking the barrier of racism and what that means for my children. And people tell stories that are amazing when you open up that opportunity. The other is evaluation, which typically takes place after an action. And both, as many of the participants who want to come to a brief evaluation that gives people a story to tell when they go home. Well, you're wasting your time on another meeting? the person who's faced with that needs to have an answer, which might not be readily apparent. And so the post-action evaluation is an opportunity to do that for all those who participated in it, and then a more sustained evaluation for the leadership, where you learn to understand the power dynamics that happened in this action. What reaction did we want to get? Did we get it? Why? Why not? How do we use that to build for what comes next? So there's lots of organizer questions that I think can be incorporated in the work. Arnie Graff, who's a friend of mine, an organizer, said he went to a training session with Alinsky, and he kept telling action after action. And Alinsky finally said to him, "Young man, you were nothing but a pile of undigested actions."
That's real. That's real. Kind of just going a little bit on that too, like, you know, I think there's a lot of like reflection and evaluation in the organizing work itself, right? But I'm also wondering what it looks like to like the practical side of just keeping ourselves sustained, in terms of being able to even show up for the people that we're trying to organize. And if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, in your staff, I mean, let's say you have a staff of 5 organizers. You need to take timeouts for yourselves. Sometimes in the SNCC, I was on the SNCC staff for about 4 years. And sometimes, at its peak, there were about 225 full-time people, probably about 150 who were in the field, and the others who were support staff in one way or another. And we would all gather in these staff meetings that went several days. And I tell you, the arguments would become intense. And just when you thought things were becoming so brittle that there was going to be a split, one of the black SNCC staff people, typically one of the freedom singers, but not necessarily, would get up and start singing. And it would be, you know, like in the middle of this heated argument, and of course everyone knew, time out. We need to take a time out. And so we'd all slowly rise, and then, as you probably know, in SNCC singing, we'd get in a circle, and we'd cross our arms like this and take the hand of the person here, and the hand of the person here, and we'd sing and we'd rock together like this. And it restored what Foreman called the band of brothers and sisters, circle of trust.
Natalya, I'm wondering what lessons and questions?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for that, Mike, and the rest of the panelists for offering just this continual, like, very astute wisdom. I love it. And my heart right now is just really sort of thinking about what you were saying, Fran, around the importance of centering our working class and poor folks. And that's a lesson that I'm always trying to embody, is how do we really continually center our most directly impacted folks with having that intersectionality approach. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of expand upon the importance of rejecting and challenging top-down leadership, and just sort of the importance of having robust bottom-up leadership in our movement work.
Yeah, well, I am one that very much believes in political education. You know, as someone who's taught at various levels, I taught at the college level and I've taught at the community level, is I was consistently impressed by the level of astuteness that people at the community level are able to articulate their own oppression. And so the very idea that you as an organizer are going to be the sole fountain of truth is not true. You can learn so much. I mean, I hate to say this, but Fannie Lou Hamer is such an example of that. This was a woman that was on a plantation, got fired because she ran into the sick people, and they took her to register to vote, and it was a big problem. She finally registered to vote, and she got fired. Now, this was really, it shows you the bravery, but it also shows you from how she spoke. That was after actually years of interacting with SNCC. SNCC had, for example, a comic book, I don't know if you remember this, Phil, on Vietnam, and that's what it was called, Vietnam. And one of the SNCC artists had done the graphics on it, and it basically told the history of Vietnamese colonialism, French colonialism, up to where the Americans took over from that. It's a lot of this idea, somebody said about, breaking down complex ideas. They tried to make them more complex than they are. That's the reason I was so happy when that slogan came out about the 99% versus the 1%, because it's so vivid, that everybody can understand it, and then everybody did understand it. And it gave rise, in a sense, to the Bernie Sanders, campaign, where people were able to talk about class issues in a presidential campaign in a way that I had not seen them talked about in prior, ways. So that's the one lesson, not to underestimate community people and their understanding of their own oppression and what you can learn from that experience. You might articulate it a little differently with your college education, etc. But I go with the view that there's not a single thing that you can't learn from every individual that you meet. You can. You just learn from them. I think that's the most important lesson.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was extremely powerful, and it's just making me sort of think about how we help people sort of after they're able to articulate their own experience, how can they then effectively link their own struggle, again, in that international context. And I'm just wondering, for you and honestly all of the panelists to chime in about how do we effectively link our struggles in the US with that of our siblings in Palestine and other parts of the global South, while ensuring that we're again centering intersectionality.
Daphne, you were raising your hand. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, I just want to make two quick comments about what's just been said. That one of the things that I found brilliant was that you really had to listen to Bob Moses. Bob never raised his voice. You had to tune in and listen. And Diane Nash was the same way. They never raised their voices. So every single word was measured. You could actually, there were times that I felt like I could see their brains, that they spoke so precisely. And that ability to have someone engage you in that way, as opposed to the voice that just screams. I mean, you need the screams, but that was very strategic on their parts. And then there's another woman, Septima Clark. I think that a lot of people need to pay very close attention to the organizing strategies Ms. Clark had, the work that she did, the power that she brought to the table, again, in a very underestimated way.
Jacob or Natalya, I'm wondering if we could get a question for Phil, and then I want to turn it over to the audience for a little while.
Yeah. Phil, I think there was, I think maybe this is a question for everyone too, but I think you spoke about it a little bit more closely in some of the readings that I think Lynn had provided us. But I think something that I still really am curious to know more about is how 1964 really was a pivotal point, right, in Stink's history, and as you described, right, it kind of went downhill from there. But I think Fran was also saying that, like, the organization had achieved its purpose. But I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to the dynamics of what it meant to lose that challenge, right, at the National Democratic Convention, and what that means for organizers like us and young people too. Because I think one thing that I experience a lot of talking to young people is we're very apathetic. The system that we have experienced over the last 20 years is, I would say, probably very different than maybe when y'all were organizing in the 60s, right? And so I think, if you could just speak to a little bit more of like what it means to lose within the system, right? And then what that means for working outside the system, and like how that complicates people's organizing experiences.
Well, I guess I was thinking that there were several, I thought, key in Stick history. And you mentioned one of them. So in some ways, the question is, for me, thinking about it, is how do you take what are defeats, or seemingly defeats, and live with them, and recast them in new clothes, let's put it that way. I remember when SNCC, if nothing else, was extremely controversial, and we loved it. And when we came out against the war in Vietnam, we were the first mainstream civil rights organization to do that. And we took a big hit financially as well as politically. A few years later, when we came out against anti-Semitism, similar and maybe somewhat more drastic in terms of certain key sections. And but Stick didn't have, by and large, there probably were a few people who said, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done this. But we eagerly, because we felt it was opening up new fields that had to be open. In some ways, October 7th did that this year. And the fact that, it's interesting, there's a slogan, Free Palestine, Free Palestine. And I think we need to look at it the other way too. Palestine is freeing us. Because for some of the things that we're able to raise now, particularly at the mainstream level, would never have been thought about to be raised. And people are brave enough to do it.
I love that.
So, let me just stop there.
I'd like to make one comment. The vision every single day of those bombs falling, I guess I want to speak to the level of the change in the technology, both in terms of these phones that everybody has, and that you get there's some alternative news sources, but that vision. Linda told me to turn off the TV because it was making me sick, and I still feel a little sick, about it. But to watch genocide unfolding before your very eyes, not only people who are conscious of like the Palestinian struggle and the elephant in the room, but the people I live with who are talking about, isn't it awful? They're not talking about October 7th. They're talking about those bombs falling and literally destroying a whole land of people and children, and they get it, despite the propaganda of trying to say any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, you know, type of thing, and all the rest of the propaganda machine for Israel has not been able to, I think, surmount all the different arenas of
Absolutely.
information. That is a very different plateau that you guys are working on.
Absolutely.
We only have, unfortunately, other panelists have to come in here and start preparing in maybe 10 minutes. I want to make sure that we get at least one, maybe two questions from the audience. And I want to ask folks to specifically think about, let's keep the focus on lessons. And if there are organizing lessons that we could clarify that could potentially help you in your own organizing. If anyone has a thought about a lesson that you'd like to hear some more about, let's hear potentially one. There's my timer right there. We have time for one short question or answer, or for two short ones, or potentially for one longer one. And actually,
for 12:30. Go an extra 10 minutes. Go a little.
Say that one more time.
I'm one of the 12:30 panelists. Let's go a little. Come on, these guys.
I know it's very I want it to be respectful of the folks coming in.
No, I appreciate that. We'll respect it. Go.
All right. Let's take a question from the audience then. Rick.
Not really a question, but I just have to say, it's such an honor to see you all here and to be blessed with your presence. Names that we have, revered and known, and some of you we've known and some of you haven't, but just thank you, Lynn, for putting this together.
Yes, thank you.
It's an incredible honor.
I'd like to say, these young people who are struggling and working so diligently to continue rotating this earth on the axis of affirmation and change. I feel it's more daunting for you than it was for us, because your generation is blinded by the bling. And that bling shines so brightly, and it resonates. I mean, Bouncy, I call her Bouncy. Bouncy did the Renaissance screening in Israel. Why was she not called on the carpet? Why? If I say something, I'm being disrespectful to her. But if y'all say something, that resonates a whole different way. So, Beyonce, excuse me. I call her Bouncy. No disrespect. But you all need to continue to come to us, just as we need to continue to tune our listening to hear you and to figure out how we work in structures that are so opposed to everything we're trying to do. And one of the things that I think continues to crush so much of what we're attempting to do is, I call it capitalism. Because trying to do this work in the construct of capitalism is just mind-boggling. And every time I purchase something now, it's like, oh, do I really want to do that? But then I have to do so. I think more discussion around and more strategies around how you navigate in an economic system that has you so constrained, how you navigate through that to also accomplish the goals of liberation. And how do you keep, given that we are oppressed by so much, how do you keep liberation in your spirit? How do you put it on you? How do you wear it? How do you hear it? How do you stride in it? So that you aren't so beaten down that you say, I can't get up today. I mean, I have a lot of them days, y'all. I have them days. But how do you use it to lift you up? And what are the examples that help that? And one of the things that's really helping me right now, the fact that indigenous people in America are talking about Palestine. That every day, that is a light that I go towards, and that the power and voices of indigenous people are rising in ways that I don't think the Israelis quite thought would happen. Or Biden.
Yes.
Thanking you all, wonderful. One of the things that I miss when we gather here is to bring us together is music. And we don't sing, and we need to sing. And saying what you just said, I would say, woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Yes, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Yes, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Yes.
I was in SNCC in Los Angeles, and it was great to see and hear those who have spoken today. There were some voices also back in the day, back in the 60s. There was James and Grace Boggs.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh
And
yes.
one of the pieces they put out back in the day was the awesome responsibilities of revolutionary leadership. And what they said is that we have to move beyond protests, demonstrations, uprisings, spontaneous uprisings. And something Phil has said is very critical, is he talked about organizing. The SNCC helped put in him this whole notion, made it very clear about organizing. Kwame Ture, or Stokely, he would say organization was the critical thing. We are the many and the rulers are the few. They just have us out organized. I go back to James and Grace Boggs. They said we had to take power away from those who have the power, because those who have wielded power have done it selfishly and barbarically, and we have to create organization now that's gonna to help us take the power away from them. And that's what I would put out to everyone here. We have to stop these simple protests and move to creating that organization. If you go online, one of the good things about these damn phones and stuff, you go online and put in, type it into Google, the awesome responsibilities of revolutionary leadership, the piece will come up. And they say that the organization that we create has to have several functions. One of them has to be constant ideological development and struggle. Another has to be, and I'm just putting some of my own words, ruthless self-criticism, Before I can criticize you, I have to admit my own shortcomings and tell you what I'm gonna do to correct them. And it also says that there has to be organized activity for everybody in the unit. You don't just get up in the morning and do what you want to do. You do what the organization has decided you need to do to advance its agenda in terms of taking power. I'm going to shut up because I know time is what it is. But this is critical, and this is something the movement. Most people in our movement don't want to face, because it's gonna mean that we're gonna lose some lives. It's gonna be very dangerous and very hard. But that's where the movement needs to go. We got to get beyond these protests and look at how we're going to take power.
Thank you. I want to pose a question to Phil. Phil, is my memory right that you did spend some time working with James Box?
I did.
Would you like to follow up maybe with something that stood out to you about James's work?
I think it's really hard to do given the time.
Sure.
But I just would say, as my friend Ron said, that he very vigilant and let's break some of these liberal stereotypes and create something new. And I think Grace, after Jimmy died, extended the idea and talked about what are the key questions we need to ask as a human being in the 21st century. And how is that maybe different than that question in the 20th century? And different people. So I totally agree.
Thank you.
We're going to wrap up in 1 second, but I see you have a...
Well, I have a question, and I apologize for not being here earlier, because maybe this was covered, in which case we just move on, but just by way of introduction and appreciation of that last remark. So the next panel that I'm part of with colleague Kunasaki Hall is on Corporation Jackson Redo, and in some ways we think Corporation Jackson Mississippi is trying to take some of those strategic thoughts and make them into stuff not only local, but regional, national, international in terms of formulation. But the last time I was with this man here, with Phil, was when we were doing some celebrations of our sister Betita Martinez, Elizabeth Betita Martinez Sutherland, when she was known as in SNCC. And we co-edited, Betita and myself, a book called We Have Not Been Moved, looking at, amongst other things, racism and militarism, but especially my question, it was looking at Kwame Stokely's call to white folk to say, in some ways, especially the call for white folk to organize in our own communities, to sort of shake up and rattle up our part of the empire, was never taken up from 68, 69 till when the book came out until today. And particular thoughts, strategic thoughts from you all about that affair, about that issue. It's another big question, but any quick thoughts if you want to do it. And remember, I'm on the next panel, so you take an extra 5-10 minutes, we're going to be okay.
I want to interrupt you real quick. Is it Linda? Are you about to have your panel?
No, I have to be on a Zoom.
Oh, okay. I was going to suggest that people check out Linda's panel, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
How long?
Daphne, you, I'll see it.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that was it. That was my question. I'm done.
Francis?
One of the areas, now other people might disagree with this, but that I think we made at the time, one of the things that I worked with in the Third World Women's Alliance is I was the representative to the Puerto Rico Solidarity Committee. So that was part of the intersection of the various different movements. And they recently came out with a book which they asked me to write a little blurb about called Revolution Around the Corner. And it sounded very much like Max Albaum's book, Revolution in the Air. They both had a theme, though, in that book, is that we did think revolution was around the corner. We did think revolution was in the air. And the point was, some of the ways that we began to organize was with a misassessment that revolution was right around the corner. And therefore, I think even the Grace Boggs speech was written in a time when there was so much movement going on, particularly in the Black liberation movement, and that focused us a lot in terms of, but in the back of our minds was the thought that capitalism was crumbling and that we were a part of a third world struggle that was going to move on to peace and justice type of thing. I think we have to be very careful because right now we've got the fascist organizing in the electoral arena. And if they, by any chance, get in only 1 year from now, we will have certain democratic rights that we have curtailed in which we're not able to organize because those rights will have been taken away from us. So I just wanna leave my last remarks with people registering that we have particularly tasks today that we did not have back then. That's the reason why I say, when you said, it's more difficult for us, Daphne, today, in terms of organizing in some ways than it was back then, I agree with that, completely.
We're gonna wrap up in 1 second here. You wanted to say something about H-Rap
I
Brown?
want to say Jamil Al-Amin,
Yes.
only H-Rap Brown, he's been locked up 23 years for something he did not do. He's in Tucson, Arizona. I went to see him.
All right.
His spirits are high, he's still very committed to struggle, but we have to press the state to release him. No disrespect to anyone here, but we gotta stop this voting for Tweedledee over Tweedledum. We have to take power away from those with the power. We have to create the organization to do it.
Yeah.
And that's our
That
task.
sounds good, but if fascism comes into this country, we won't be able to even have a leaflet like that.
But we live in a police state. Biden presides over what is now a police state. And it wouldn't be any different than, of course, with Trump, as it was now.
Well now.
I want to interject real quick. Since people are starting to get up and leave, I know you're going to other panels. I want to make sure we get a photo. If you were in the movement together, I think it would be great to get a nice big group photo, and then a photo of all the panelists together as well.
The panelists first, and then
Let's do the panelists first, and then please stick around if you're in a movement and you